right. So the reading tonight spans a couple chapters. So the first part comes from Genesis 18, 1 through 15. Yeah, but he didn't get it recorded. Sorry. So, God appeared to Abraham by the oak grove of Mamre, while Abraham sat at the entrance to his tent in the heat of the day. Looking up, Abraham saw 3 travelers standing nearby. When he saw them, Abraham ran from the entrance of the tent to greet them, and bowing to the ground said, "If I have found favor in your eyes, please do not pass by our tent. Let some water be brought, that you may bathe your feet, and then rest yourselves beneath this tree. As you have come to your faithful one, let me bring you a little food, that you may refresh yourselves. Afterward, you may go on your way." When he saw them, "Very well," they replied, "do as you have said." Abraham hurried into the tent to Sarah and said, "Quick, take a bushel of fine flour and knead it into loaves of bread." Abraham then ran to the herd, selected a choice and tender calf, and sent a worker hurry to prepare it. Then Abraham took cheese and milk and the calf which had been prepared and placed it before the travelers, and he waited on them under the tree while they ate. "Where is Sarah?" they asked. "She is there in the tent," Abraham replied. One of them said, "I will surely return to you this time next year, and Sarah will then have a child." Sarah was listening at the entrance of the tent just behind him. Now Sarah and Abraham were old, well on in years, and Sarah no longer had her periods. Sarah laughed within herself. "An old woman like me get pregnant with this old man of a husband?" God said to Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh, saying, 'Me have a baby, an old woman like me?' Is anything too hard for God? I'll be back about this time next year, and Sarah will have a baby." Sarah lied. She said, "I didn't laugh," because she was afraid. But he said, "Yes, you did. You laughed." And then the continuation of that will be in Genesis 21, 1 through 7. "And the Lord visited Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did unto Sarah as he had spoken. For Sarah conceived and bare Abraham a son in his old age, at the set time of which God had spoken to him. And Abraham called the name of his son that was born unto him, who Sarah bore to him, Isaac, which is derived from the Hebrew word for laughter. And Abraham circumcised his son, Isaac, being 8 days old, as God had commanded him. And Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born unto him. And Sarah said, God hath made me to laugh, so that all that hear will laugh with me. And she said, Who would have said unto Abraham that Sarah should have given children suck? For I have borne him a son in his old age. So, it's passages like this one that make me think that we don't properly appreciate God's flair for the dramatic. You'd expect some degree of special effects from a divine appearance, and certainly God delivers this on many occasions. There are angels singing in the skies, and bushes that burn without burning, and a voice that thunders down from the heavens. There are any number of spectacles. And if you're going to be God and appear before mortals, you might as well turn on the pyrotechnics and give them a show. Except in this story, God doesn't. He doesn't let Abraham or Sarah even know that she's God. The idea was to be incognito, blend in with the locals, appear as some regular Joe to see if Abraham offers his full hospitality willingly and eagerly, and to see if Sarah receives joyfully the news of their child to be born. Yet even so, it's like God can't help but tip her hand at certain times. God could have gone on appearing as a member of a normal traveling party, passing through, enjoying some of the local hospitality. But then she just can't resist a bit of clairvoyance. So she asks where Abraham's wife Sarah is, revealing that she knows Sarah by name and knows enough to wonder at her absence. And then, having established at the very least that there is more to this traveler than meets the eye, God predicts to both Abraham and Sarah, who was listening in, that they will have a child together. Abraham had already received this particular prediction from God in whatever God's normal form is. So he, of all people, has reason here to begin to suspect that something is up with his visitor. Sarah does not have that benefit, so she laughs. She laughs to herself at the thought of a 90-year-old woman going through pregnancy, bearing a child, suckling that child at her withered breast. And then when God reveals that she was aware of the laugh Sarah had in private, Sarah starts to realize she's miscalculated. So she lies and says she didn't laugh. Or she might have meant to take it back, given the language. Say that she hadn't meant to laugh at that. She just randomly thought about a great joke she had heard earlier. But of course that doesn't work because it's God and she knows things. And I feel like I'm beginning to sound like a broken record about this, but it seems distinctly unfair to me that once again, we, the readers of biblical stories, are having a good laugh at the silly person over there who doubted God, just like we do with Thomas, just like we do with Martha, just like we do with every single person who questions the impossible. Of course, Sarah laughs at this. She is 90. She stopped menstruating a long time ago. Her body is old and frail, and childbirth is hard. The thought of her bearing a child is funny. You would probably laugh at that too in her shoes. Especially because God didn't even turn on the special effects for her. Like, she's called to wonder if anything is too hard or too wonderful for God to do, but how's she supposed to know that the random guy her husband decided to feed was also God Almighty? And I think we have to consider that, as I've observed before, opening oneself up to hope takes courage. And the real tragedy of Sarah's story is just how long she spent opening herself up to hope only to be disappointed over and over again. I'm sure we all know someone who has struggled with fertility, so we know the toll it can take to keep trying, to believe that things might be different this time. She spent decades of her life hoping for a child. And we don't know when she stopped menstruating and when she stopped trying, only that she had wanted one and now it was completely impossible. She didn't even have the necessary ingredients. And it's one thing to ask a young woman to try again after she's been disappointed. Maybe after she's been disappointed a few times. That alone is hard. But that's not at all the situation here. Sarah had already gone through all of that. Many times, once a month for most of her life. Even with conservative estimates of how early she started menopause, we're still looking at around 400 or 500 times that she had hoped for a child and been disappointed. How often have you failed at something 100 times and kept trying? 200, 400. It's a lot, and that's what we're looking at with Sarah. Plus, the stakes are even higher for Sarah than those struggling with infertility in our age, because in her culture, fertility and social status are intertwined. Because of her inability to conceive, Sarah is seen as less of a woman, deserving of less dignity. So entrenched was that link between fertility and social status that Sarah's own handmaiden, Hagar, feels empowered to make slights and insults over Sarah's struggles. Now, there's a whole lot of back and forth between those two, and they both say and do a lot of things that are not okay. But in the end, the system in place isn't fair to either woman. Hagar shouldn't be seen as less than Sarah in the first place, and Sarah shouldn't be seen as less than Hagar for being unable to bring forth a child. In either case, the relationship between fertility and social status raises the stakes. So this is a completely different story of difficulty with fertility, because not only has Sarah been disappointed time and time again, not only has she been rendered an object of scorn and pity, she's accepted her fate at this point. She's realized that the time for such things has passed. She's contented herself with her lot. Or maybe she hasn't. Maybe she's still mad as hell about it. But she at least knew that she would never have a child at this point and had accepted it. She knew she was beyond all ability. Then some random stranger comes along, eats a bunch of her and her husband's food, and dares to say that she's wrong, dares to ask her to open herself up to that hope that was so hard a door to close in the first place. It is one thing to ask a woman to hope. It's another thing entirely to ask her to open herself up to a hope that she's abandoned with good reason. Giving up that hope and grieving that possibility is a long, emotional process. It would have been hard on her. There were a million little pinpricks along the way, and we can't imagine how she would have felt watching her friends cradle their babies, carry their children, show pride in their adult progeny and their grandchildren. Every blessing to another would have been a little stab to her. And she would have thought about how much more she deserved that favor than so many of the other women she knew. And then she would have felt bad about it and wondered if God were punishing her in the first place. There would be an untold baggage to work through to get her to that point of acceptance, and now someone wants to undo that. And for all the criticism heaped upon her for laughing in the way she does, it's worth thinking about the fact that her laughter is a defense mechanism. If she laughs, it's because she's anticipating all the people who will laugh at her, who will make jokes about the old lady with the newborn, who will speak in whispers and suddenly go silent when she walks into the room. She laughs perhaps at the irony of her lot, to spend one's whole life begging for a child and receive that blessing only when it would render her an object of derision, rather than redeeming her status. And Sarah perhaps also laughs because she recognizes the absurdity and she knows that what she is hearing is an impossibility. But that's the thing, is we worship a God who delights in the impossible and who takes action when things seem beyond hopeless. We have this formula in our heads from the movies and the comic books and every other story we interact with, where we expect salvation to come just when things are at their darkest. That's what we expect, that the woman tied to the train tracks will be saved when the train is inches away, that the reinforcements called in in the second act will finally come just when the hero is cornered, that the timer will count down to the very last second before the bomb is defused. But that is not the way that God works. God has this habit at times of waiting until the game has already been lost. God comes in after the train has passed, after the bomb goes off. God comes in when defeat is not only certain, but it's already come to pass. She waits until Lazarus has been dead in the tomb for 4 days and then resurrects him. God waits until the world is devoured by a flood and then draws the waters back. She is a God of doing the impossible, and she doesn't come in when we expect her to. She comes later than that, but she comes all the same. And that's fine and dandy unless you're the person tied to the train tracks. Unless you're the one left in the tomb. It's all well and good unless you're the one facing the pain of infertility for your entire life until God finds it fit to swoop in and give you the most geriatric pregnancy of all time. I did look that up. In those cases, it kind of feels like God might have saved you a lot of pain by intervening a little sooner. Like maybe God didn't have to keep you waiting that long. Salvation in the nick of time might have been nice. Better yet, maybe God could have intervened before the problem became a problem. Lord knows why Sarah had to suffer all those years just for God to come in the 12th hour and give her the child she had been begging for her entire life. And this matters because so many of us are still waiting for a blessing. Still waiting for God to take action against whatever leaves us suffering in body or in spirit. There are those who have been waiting for God to give them a break in the bills and the rent. There are those who've been waiting for God to give them the resources to escape harmful and abusive situations. There are those who've been waiting for God to come through with a miracle cure or operation. There are those who have been waiting for God to bless them with a place to live. Sarah is far from the only person left waiting for God's blessing. I'd wager we've all done it at some point. So what does it mean that they've been left to suffer because God would rather show up after defeat and then change the story? Is that comforting? Does that undo the damage? In Sarah's case, for example, though she does indeed bear a child, she faces derision still. She is still insulted and scorned by her social inferiors. So what comfort is it that God eventually showed up after decades of longing and pain and shame? I finished writing my first draft of this sermon late on a Wednesday night after work. Then I gathered my things and I walked to catch my bus, and as I approached the stop, I felt that little drop in my stomach that you get when you go to reach for your wallet and it's not there. And I resigned myself to then walking back to my workplace where I thought I'd left it on the desk, and then I would make another walk back to the bus so I could catch the very last bus of the night. And when I got there, the wallet was not on the desk. It was not in the Subaru I'd been driving for work all day. It was not in the van we were using for storage until the flat tire gets fixed. It was not in the kitchen. It was not at the front desk. It was not in the bathroom, and it was not in the fridge. It was not in my backpack. I went to the gas station where I had filled up late in the shift, and it was not there. I called the Star Market where I last remembered seeing it, and it was not there. And then I gave up for the night. The next day, I got in my car because I didn't have my T-Pass, so I couldn't catch the bus, and my car wouldn't start. So at this point, I figured someone really didn't want me getting to work that day. And I called my boss to ask if she could find coverage, and she did, and I stayed home and sulked. Sulked because of my own absent-mindedness, and sulked because how could this happen to me? But moreover, I sulked because I was disappointed in people, because at a certain point, you have to resign yourself to the fact that the wallet is not hiding somewhere. It's been a while. It's probably been found and taken, along with the $5 I had and my monthly T-Pass and my debit card and my ID. And I was disappointed in humanity, because once again I saw someone seeking their own selfish gain from the misfortune of another, so I wrapped myself in pity and fell asleep early. The next day I finally gave up, replaced my debit card, ordered a new driver's license, went to the train station to get a new T-Pass, and I accepted that the wallet wasn't coming back, though I was still angry and disappointed that things hadn't gone better. I started work. And about halfway through the shift, I walked back from bringing food to a client, and my wallet was sitting on top of the Subaru that I had been driving for 3 hours, that my coworkers had driven for 8 hours the day before, that had sat in the parking lot of a homeless shelter where theft is unfortunately very common. Somehow it had not been moved from the top of the vehicle for 2 days. And let me start by saying that I am fully aware that not having my wallet for 2 days pales 1,000 times in comparison to a lifetime of infertility. But still, it's like I knew that God was with me, that God was providing solace and comfort. But I was disappointed that God wasn't with me in the miraculous way I wanted her to be. What I did not expect was that she was the entire time holding my leather billfold to the top of a moving vehicle, while also comforting me. She didn't show up in the nick of time. She didn't show up after I gave up and spent $25 so I can have 2 driver's licenses. She did, in fact, show up earlier than all of that, or she didn't show up at all because she was there the whole time. We have this tendency of only seeing God when God takes action. So we notice God when the seas are parted. We notice her when the horns blow and the walls come down. We notice God when the giant fish spits back its prophetic dinner. But we have trouble paying attention to God when God is not taking swift, decisive action. We are bad at seeing that God is with us even while we are struggling, even while we are fighting with ourselves, and even while we are waiting for God, she is there with us. God was with Sarah the whole time. Every second of her long wait for a child, she suffered with Sarah. Every moment of disappointment, every foul comment hurled Sarah's way, even the ones she didn't hear herself. God not only accompanied Sarah for every step of her struggle, but God accompanied many, many other women faced with the same frustration. God knew in every second the joy that would someday come forth from that pain, and God also knows in the moment of joy how much pain has been felt prior to the extension of her redemption. To us, all of this appears as one long, long period of tribulation, followed by one moment of relief that comes too late. To God, it's a process. And I don't know why that process has to go the way it does. I don't know why it's easy for some people and impossible for others. There are a lot of things I don't know and don't understand, and the suffering of humankind is pretty high on that list. So I don't know why Sarah had to suffer for 90 years before finally getting to have a child. I don't know why the Israelites wandered the desert for 40 years before finding the promised land. And selfishly, I don't know why I had to endure 2 days of agonizing anxiety before my wallet popped up again. But I can tell you, the second it reappeared, it did not matter how stressful those 2 days had been. And I know, too, that when Sarah finally did give birth, she gave birth in joyous laughter. And I know that no matter how painful the process, it doesn't matter so much once everything has worked out. And I know, too, that God is beyond time. That in her eyes, things have already worked out even before they've gone wrong. Thank you.
It's a time in our service where we collect an offering. For those attending MCC Boston through social media, you too can participate by going to our website at mccboston.org and clicking on the donate button there for that purpose. Thank you for being a part of our church family. Members and friends of MCC Boston, in the early years of our denomination, our founder, the Reverend Dr. Troy Perry, spoke about a lesson he learned as a little boy, that a coward dies 1,000 deaths, but the brave dies only once. As a fellowship, we've come to learn that we only do a disservice to ourselves and to God by shrinking into obscurity and denying gifts meant to empower us to do God's work. This week marks the 50th anniversary of one of the most tragic events in MCC history, when 32 members of the Metropolitan Community Church of New Orleans were burned to death in the upstairs lounge, a second-floor bar that was the temporary meeting space of the MCC Church. The fire was intentionally set in the stairwell of the building, blocking people's ability to escape. There were no fire escapes on the front of the building, and the windows themselves were covered with bars. One MCC member did manage to squeeze through, but didn't survive the fall. MCC pastor Bill Larson became entrapped in one of the windows, ultimately dying in full view of onlookers. The assistant pastor, George Mitchell, did escape to the roof, but then returned to the fire after realizing his partner was no longer with him. When their bodies were found, they were intertwined, giving a silent testimony to his ultimate sacrifice and the love that these two men shared. At the time of the fire, MCC had only existed for 4 years, and this was the third arson fire to target an MCC church. Given the level of persecution, it would have been understandable if MCC would have decided to go underground and halt its visible presence. But a denomination learned early on how paralyzing fear can be and how true liberation from transphobia and homophobia can only arise by being bold visionaries for Christ. For more than 50 years, this church has been empowering members of our community and reminding them that they need not be afraid anymore, that God has created them in God's own image, and that as queer Christians, we are called to take up the cross of transphobia and homophobia and work for a world where all people can fulfill their God-given calling. So this week, as we continue our season of Pride, consider what you might do to help enable MCC Boston to be bold in its mission. For now, as the basket is presented, please give as you are able, and may God continue to bless you and MCC Boston. Thank you.